All right, very good. Welcome, everyone. I started the stream just a few minutes early in case we had any kind of a hiccup, because try as I might, sometimes things happen. So it looks like we're good. I'm just checking on a few things, and I'm just going to chat with you for a few minutes until the top of the hour. So if you're here early, welcome. I'm so glad that you joined me today. We are going to talk about Dresden Plate, not just Dresden Plate for the Summer Splash project, but Dresden Plate in general. So if you've always been interested in how to do a Dresden plate and wondered if it might be something fun to try, this is your opportunity to kind of see how it's done and some of the possibilities that it has for really interesting and unique designs. I'm excited to share some of that with you. So I woke up about 4 o'clock this morning, which I often do, especially if I have something like this planned because it's on my mind and I need to make sure that I have all my ducks in a row. So maybe after this is over, I'll breathe a deep, big sigh of relief and pour myself a cup of coffee and rest for a few minutes. Um, I went on a walk this morning only did about a mile and a half, but I'm sort of renewing my commitment to take better care of my body by making just good choices, one thing at a time. So that was good. It was only about 65 degrees and it was a little bit breezy, so it was perfect walking weather. I live in the country in a really rural part of Nebraska. There's not a lot out here besides cows and cornfields, so I can walk 4 to 6 miles without seeing anybody, which is kind of nice. You don't have to worry about how you're dressed or how you look. So that's kind of fun. All right, 11:57. We still have a little bit of time to go. If you are here early, if you would like to pop in the chat and tell us where you live, maybe your town, that would be great. I'm going to silence my phone because I don't want any of that bothering us. So last time we had people from lots of different places around the world, which was really interesting. And if you're watching the recording, of course, we're glad to have you here too. Not everybody can come live. And if you're on the other side of the world, it's definitely not a time you want to be awake. So the recording lets everybody watch it at their convenience, which is really great. I have had such a good time working with the people at the Quilt Show. They are top tier professionals in every way. Good communication, good help when I need it, just very considerate. And it's been a joy to take part with them in this project called Summer Splash. So if you're not familiar with Summer Splash, let me fill you in on that just a little bit. I designed kind of a smallish wall size sampler quilt, and then I wrote the pattern. And so the quilt show then is offering the pattern booklet as a standalone and also offering kits in two different colorways for this little sampler called Summer Splash. And part of the project is that I'm teaching a series of 3 short, kind of like mini workshops related to techniques that are in the Summer Splash quilt. And so today is class number 2, and there are 3 little Dresden plate blocks in the quilt. And so today, that's what I'm sharing is all about Dresden plate. So that's the background of Summer Splash. There are still kits available if you want to peek over at the quilt show, thequiltshow.com. They have kits in both colorways. The first one I did, we called the summer version, and the second one I did, we called the autumn version. And they're both really beautiful fabrics. So that was really fun. Okay, so it's the top of the hour. So we are going to take it away. Let me kind of just start again by saying, welcome to the Stash Bandit Studio. I'm here today, hosted by thequiltshow.com. And this mini workshop on Dresden Plate relates to a quilt that I designed for them called Summer Splash. It's a small wall size sampler quilt, and it comes in two colorways. You can get the standalone pattern booklet, or you can get a kit, which includes the booklet from thequiltshow.com. So, today we're talking all about Dresden plate because there are 3 Dresden plate blocks in the quilt. And so I'm going to start out by inspiring you a little bit. Sometimes it's tempting for me to start with the math of Dresden plate, but I think generally that's a poor place to begin. People don't love the math part usually. So I'm going to inspire you first and then save the math for last. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen with you. All right. So this is the quilt that I want to make sure, I need to make sure that it's working. It lags behind real time just a little bit. Okay, we're doing fine. So this is a quilt design of mine called All Dressed Up. And this is the quilt that started my love affair with Dresden plate. I bought 20 vintage Dresden plate blocks at an antique mall for $20. And that's my kind of a bargain. Then I made small plates that are about 5 inches across to layer on top of the big plates and to put at all of the block intersections. And I had a hard time figuring out what to put the plates on, what to applique them to. They looked very dead on almost everything I tried. But when I thought of using these grays, these real dull, uh, lifeless gray morning prints, the whole quilt kind of came to life. And so that was a big lesson there. And it does make a huge difference what you put the plates on. So that's one little takeaway for you for today. This is all dressed up. It appeared in Quilt Maker, I believe. And this is another little design of mine. After I made all dressed up, I had a lot of little plates left over. And so I made this quilt that I call 28 Dresden Drive, because, of course, there are 28 little plates. It was published in McCall's Quilting under the name Diane's Dresdens. And again, I had a good time and learned a lot auditioning the plates on different backgrounds. And so that's kind of a linen look crossweave fabric in a denim color, and I really like the way they popped off of there. This is a quilt that I scribbled the idea for it on the back of an envelope once, and I had that envelope for maybe 3 or 4 years before I made the quilt. And my thought was that I would give this someday, if I had a granddaughter, I would give this to my granddaughter. Well, I had 2 grandsons, and then I had twin granddaughters. So I couldn't possibly just give it to one of them. So I still have the quilt, and it's part of my Dresden plate trunk show. But this one was really a lot of fun to make. So those half Dresdens are meant to look obviously like sunshines or sunrises. This is a little one. Again, I had this idea in my head for years, the idea of using a partial Dresden plate as a little basket. And I adore rickrack. I love vintage cotton rickrack especially, and I'm always looking for places to use it. And I had a couple of opportunities in this little quilt. So it was published in a special issue of Quilt Maker under the name Dresden Delight. There you can get a little bit closer of a look. The handles are all slightly different. The placement, which is a lesson I kind of learned the hard way. You do want to measure. You don't want to just try and eyeball it. This is an idea for a Christmas Dresden that I took quite a ways fairly recently, just in the last year or two. I love the idea of different greens for the background. And so this was one of my early auditions. And here you can see similar blocks on a table runner. And I do have the actual blocks into a quilt that's ready to be quilted. So that'll probably be a pattern that's coming before too long. I think I call this, yes, peppermint dress up. And here are some very autumn-ish or Halloween-looking Dresden plates. So super scrappy oranges, everything ranging from kind of a deep gold to a dark rust. And I have these into a quilt now as well. And it looks kind of like that. And it's called Dress Up for Halloween. And so I'm very excited to get that one quilted, hopefully in time for Halloween this year. So you can see there's a great deal of potential with Dresden plate. And I just wanted to show you those slides here at the beginning so that you could catch a vision for the wonderful things that you can do with Dresden plate. So I'm going to switch to my other camera and talk to you about fabric. So one of the things I want to talk to you about today is directional fabric. And so this applies to Dresden plate, but also this is great information to have for your quilt making life in general. So a directional fabric is one that looks one way if you lay it down, but if you rotate it, it looks a different way. That's the easiest definition that I can come up with for directional fabric. If you rotate it, it looks different. So the most obvious directional fabric is a stripe like this. But there are lots of other types of directional fabrics too. So this is definitely a directional fabric. Those are almost like flame shapes. And you can see how it looks like this. And if you rotate it, it looks completely different. And this is sort of an interesting one. I always thought polka dots were polka dots. I mean, how could they be directional? But look at this. If you rotate this, it looks different. Do you see how the up and down rows of polka dots, they're quite a ways apart in this orientation. There's a good inch in between there. But look, if you put it in this orientation, the vertical rows, there is only about half an inch between those polka dots. So it's subtle, but it's worth paying attention to because sometimes you can get yourself into an unexpected situation if you fail to notice that difference. Here are some raindrops. Let's turn those around. And so that's kind of a real obvious one. Their direction is a little bit diagonal. And so if you switch that or rotate it, you can see completely different look. Sometimes a plaid can be directional. So here, the light pink stripes are going horizontally. And if you rotate it, now there are light pink stripes going horizontally, but it does completely change the look of the fabric. And so this is sort of the kind of fabric that you would say is not really directional. Technically, it might be, but if you rotate it, you know, if you cut patches from this and rotated them every which way, you're not going to get a hugely different look. And something like this, which I call a ditzy print, where it's kind of a toss, everything is just tossed into the print. It doesn't cause you any problems if you change the orientation. And there's another one. Pretty much looks the same no matter what you do. So how does that apply to Dresden plate? Well, let me show you this. Here are some Dresden blades that I cut from a striped fabric. And so you can see, even just looking at these two blades, how differently they appear. So I went ahead and created partial plates from those patches. So here is the first one. And this is kind of fun when you cut a stripe so that it goes from side to side on the blade. You can kind of get this circular effect in the whole block, which is very interesting. But look at when we cut them this way instead. Completely different look. And there's not one that's more right than the other. Neither is right or wrong. They're just totally different. And I wanted to bring that up because one of the fabrics, or maybe even two of the fabrics in the kits for the Dresden plates are directional. And so you can put the stripes whichever direction you want. They're pretty subtle, but that's just really useful information for your future quilt making. And I want to show you the fabric that that was cut from, because this feels counterintuitive to me. If you want the stripes to go across the blade, then you have to cut your strip going with the stripes, like so. If you want your stripes to go up and down the blade, then you have to cut your strip against the stripes. And so it's worth having a little template and testing it out to make sure that you are thinking correctly, because sometimes for some reason, I kind of want to think about that backwards. So last lesson, we talked a little bit about templates and cutting for Dresden plate, but I wanted to just touch on that briefly again. So sometimes if you bought a pattern or a kit, you might have an acrylic template that looks something like this, and you would use that to cut your blades. So they come in all different sizes, and you can see these are different angles. And we'll get to that in a little bit. We'll get to the math. You don't need to worry about it. Whoops, right at the moment. So you can see though, the angle of this blade is considerably different than the angle on this one. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I do want to show you these are the templates that are in the Summer Splash pattern. And so if you don't, you likely wouldn't have an acrylic template. And so you would make a copy, or maybe there are two pictured in the pattern. And so you want to make a copy and cut those out. And then if you take them to the back of a small ruler, then you can cut them from a strip. So you would cut them from a strip, whether or not whether you're using an acrylic template or a paper template, you'd still cut them from a strip. And so you just lay this on here like so, and you would do your cleanup cut. And then if you were right-handed, you would go ahead and rotate, and you would line up that new cut right here, and then you would make your second cut right here. And you would just work your way down the strip rotating the ruler each time. I cut with both hands, so I think that last time I showed using both hands, which may have been a little bit confusing, but you can do it with just one hand, of course. So at this point, you will have all the blades for a plate, and you're going to then start to prepare the blades. And one thing I should say here is that I did create a handout for you, and I see that I'm not in focus here, so I was going to try to get that fixed. Don't know quite how to make that happen. There we go. I did prepare a handout, and Kristen is going to put a link to the handout in the chat, and we will also put that in the forums on thequiltshow.com. So you will have worded or step-by-step instructions in words, in writing, that you can refer to. So for each of the blades, what you're going to want to do is fold it in half with the right sides together, and you're going to sew here at the wide end, and you're going to sew a 1/4 of an inch seam. And I wanted to put my presser foot here so that you could see this. You do want to start sewing here at the raw edges, because you want to line those up nicely and sew a 1/4 of an inch seam along here. You do want to shorten your stitch length down to about 2 millimeters, because this is not a very long distance. This is a much bigger piece that I'm just using for demonstration today so that you could see it a little better. Your patches for Summer Splash will be quite a bit smaller. And so when it's just a very short distance on Summer Splash, it's about 1/2 an inch, you need those stitches to be tiny. And you're going to put a little bit of pressure on this a little bit later. So shorten your stitch length, and then you're going to sew starting at the raw edges with a 1/4 of an inch seam all the way along there. So that will bring you to this point. And I chain piece these right through the machine, one after the other, so it would look just like this. And I used a dark thread so that you could see it. In reality, you would use a neutral thread probably. So, and then you will cut these apart. And then we're going to trim them. And so let me get my next little set of samples. So here are the samples. There you can see I've sewn, and I made the seam allowance fatter only for the purposes of visibility. So in reality, for Summer Splash, this is how it would look. It would be tiny. So once you sew across the ends of all the blades, you're going to want to trim a little bit off of here. And I trim a long, skinny triangle off, because that is a better shape for the step that comes next. Okay, so I'm going to trim this down to a 1/4 of an inch so it's a little more realistic. And then what I do is I put one of these fingers up inside that blade, and I kind of push my finger toward the end. Then I take my thumbnail and I run it down that seam to flatten it. So I press that seam open with my thumbnail, and that's an important step. So now you can kind of see here why we cut a long skinny triangle off. It fits the shape of the blade tip a little better. So you'll do that to all of them. One finger goes up inside, and then your thumbnail presses hard down along here to press that open. So let me do it on one that's the actual size for Summer Splash. So you would trim a long skinny triangle off. So there you can kind of see the shape of my triangle. One finger inside, and you're going to open that up and press that open with your thumbnail. And then turn it right sides out. I'm going to go back to my larger one so that you can see a little better. Turn it right sides out. And then, oops, I forgot one important thing. Before we turn it right side out, you want to, with your fingernail, again, make a little crease. This is folded in half nicely, and you want to make a little crease right here. And that's important, especially for bigger blades. And I'll show you why here. Okay, so now we've pressed it open, and we're going to turn it right side out. And here, I can't emphasize enough to press, push, just nudge that tip out ever so gently, very gently with a pointed tool. Now you can see why we have this little crease here, because we want to center this seam on that crease. And we'll take this to the iron then. And I have my little toy iron again to show you. And I'm going to press that nice and flat. If you don't make that little crease in order to center this, you can get something that looks like this. Now, of course, that's an exaggeration, but you don't have to be off too much for it to cause you big problems. So having that little crease to center that seam on makes a huge difference. Okay, so you would do that to all of your blades, and then you would take them to the iron and press them nice and flat. All right. And I wanted to show you this. This is completely optional, and it does have one drawback, but if you happen to have Susan Cleveland's Prairie Pointer tool, so this is a metal, very flat little tool with a beautiful right angle up here at the top, you can use this to press your point out, and then you can actually leave that in there and press your blade with this inside. Now, the problem is this metal gets hot, very hot, and it gets hot all the way down here. So you have to be really careful not to burn yourself. And that is the voice of experience. But if you happen to have this, you can use that in that way if you want to try that. Okay. So now let's go to the next step where you're going to sew blades together. So in Summer Splash, the Dresdens are made from two different fabrics. And so when you have a plate that's made from two fabrics, it helps if you just always have the same color on the left, for instance, or the same color on the right, whichever way you want to think of it, so that you will sew them together in pairs, and then you will sew the pairs together, and so on. But if you have them always in the same orientation, then it comes out correctly, alternating the colors. So when you go to sew these together, I made a sample again a little bit bigger so that you could see. You want to line this folded edge up real nicely up here. For some reason, this bottom portion doesn't always line up perfectly. I think just because we're human. But this is the part that's important. This will be covered up anyway. This will always show. So you're going to, let me get my presser foot again. You're going to, you have two blades. You're going to put them right sides together, and you're going to sew them together here with the 1/4 inch seam. When you sew this time, you are going to back stitch here at the top. So on to the plate, back off of the plate, and then finish the seam. So you are going to back stitch here at the top, and I'll tell you why. When you take this out from your machine, you want to cut those little tails very close, right up against that fold. The reason being that if you don't, when you have a whole plate of these, and if you have little tails at every single valley, you are going to make yourself nuts. You want to be able to trim that off right there at the fold. And that's why you backstitch, so that it's still nice and secure, even though you've cut the tails off short. So every time you sew two together, you about 3 or 4 stitches on, backstitch, and then finish your seam. And then when you cut these apart, always cut nice and close to the fold there. So this is what you'll have. You will sew, see, there's a little tail that I didn't get. So that's, again, I learned that the hard way. So you always want trim those close, and so then sew them into pairs, and the pairs into foursomes, and so on, until you have yourself a nice complete plate. And it will look like this. So you don't have to do any pressing until, as far as joining them, you don't have to do any pressing until you get the full plate made. And then what you're going to do is take it to the ironing board, and you're going to press all the seams in one direction. So you're going to press in a big circle. And on the pattern, there is a QR code. And if you point your phone at that QR code and then touch the link that pops up, I did a little video showing how I press those in a circle. There's really one thing I should say. Occasionally I've run across directions that tell you to press these seams open, and it takes a lot longer to press them open, and I have never come up with any reason why that's better. So this, I really believe, is the better way. All in a circle. It's fast and it's neat, and it looks great. I do turn the plate over and just iron it from the front. Occasionally, if you have a little extra fullness right in here, if it's really bad, you can take slightly larger seam allowances here. If it's not too bad, just flatten it with your iron and know that you're going to applique a circle over the center here. And that's a good segue for our next step. First, let me show you this. So this is the actual size of the plate that you would be making for Summer Splash. And this is the actual size of the little blades. But as long as your fingers and your hands still work pretty well, it's no harder to make this little one than it is to make these bigger ones. So don't panic, you'll be fine. And now it's time to applique our center circle. And so I know some people think applique is a dark concept, a bad word, but I'm going to make it simple for you. So you will have a circle in your pattern this size. If you are making a Dresden plate without this pattern, let me address circles for just a second. I have a couple of tools that help me have circles of different sizes. This is a thing called the Whole Thing from Creative Grids, and it gives you different circles all the way from 1/2 inch up to 2 3/4. And so that comes in really useful at different times. I also have a set of acrylic circles. I don't even know for sure where I got these. I've had them forever. And they're every 1/2 inch from like 1 inch up to about 8 inches. And so those come in pretty handy too. The other thing you can do is just find a household object that's round. This is the lid off of a can of nuts. And so you can find, a coffee cup that's real solid. It does need to be an item that's pretty sturdy, a little bit solid. You can just find a household object and use that for your circle. So I use heat-resistant template plastic for this process. Anytime I have to make a circle, when I first started to teach Dresden Plate, I realized if I was going to teach it, I had to have a way to help people make beautiful, perfect circles. And so I've tried dozens of techniques, and this is the one that I have settled on. Heat resistant template plastic is just that. It's heat resistant. It's not heat proof. If you put an iron on here and leave it for a long time and it's very hot, it's going to warp. But it is heat resistant. It will try its best not to warp. So I make a heat resistant template plastic circle from my pattern. And then I want to cut the fabric out. And I find that the easiest way to do this is to use a piece of double sticky tape. So it's sticky on both sides. I put that there and I plunk that down. And then I take my scissors, and you want to cut about 3/8 of an inch bigger all the way around than your template. And so that's a little more than a fourth, but a little less than a half. And you'll get better eyeballing 3/8 of an inch with practice. Of course, if you happen to have a circle that was exactly that size, you could draw the circle, but I don't have a circle that's, that exact measurement. So that's what you want to do. And then you can remove the template for now and set it to the side. And what you're going to do is take some thread and a hand needle, and I make a quilter's knot in the end. If you don't know about a quilter's knot, point the needle and the end of the thread toward each other. Grasp that thread between your thumb and your forefinger and circle it around through however many times you want, and then just slide that off, and you will get yourself a beautiful little knot near the end every time. It's a little better than the old spit and twist method that our mamas used. Okay, so starting on the right side so that your knot is on the right-hand side, you're just going to make running stitches all the way around this little circle, just like that. And so they're not quite a fourth of an inch long. And I find that that's about the right length, So I just go all the way around. And I'm not going to make you watch me do that whole thing. But when you come all the way around to this other end, you want to bring this tail up on the right side of the fabric as well. So my knot is on the right-hand side and my final tail is on the right-hand side, both. All right, and so here is one that I have completed. So there's my stitches all the way around, and my tail and my knot are both here on the right-hand side. Okay, so I'm going to put now my template back onto the circle. Still has that tape, which is kind of helpful. And I'm just going to pull on those tails to draw that up around the circle. And it just draws up around there beautifully. Now, if you have too much seam allowance here, you might get little points. And so in that case, you'll know next time around you have to cut a little bit closer. But I pull that in tight, and I have my iron hot. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to douse this with spray starch. And it doesn't take a whole lot. You can just a tiny little bit, and it's enough. And sometimes I kind of press that in with my finger a little bit. And then I keep a Kleenex handy to kind of dab off the excess. And then I'm going to take my iron and I'm going to gently, let me move my scissors out of the way here. I'm going to gently press here along the outside edge. And I don't do this. I don't go all, because remember, this is heat resistant. It's not heat proof. So I want to iron just on the edges here. And I try to kind of leave my finger holding those threads. And I get it mostly dry. You'll be surprised. It'll get mostly dry. And then once you kind of have it kind of sort of dry, you can flip it over and you can kind of gently do this to finish drying it. And if you're finding that it's not drying with just the iron, then just let it air dry for a few hours. I find that's better than forcing the iron to dry it. Okay, so here's one that I finished. You can see this was my actual template when I made Summer Splash. It's marked EE. So because this one's nice and dry, I can just sort of coax that edge up and pop the plastic out. It just comes right off of there. And because this is pretty stiff now, it's totally dry, I can just tug slightly, tug just a tad to draw that back up again. And there I would go ahead and cut those off because those are going to become an annoyance. So there is my beautiful little circle ready to applique onto my Dresden plate. So I think the key here is to let it get totally dry because then it's kind of stiff and you can pop the plastic out pretty easily. Okay. When I get ready to applique the circle onto the plate, I actually measure to get it centered. I don't just eyeball it because it can look just right, but it's better to measure. I have kind of learned that the hard way as well. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen with you again. And we're going to go back. Let's see. Give me just 1 second. I have to go to my other camera and now share my screen. Okay. There we go. All right, so I made a little video of appliquing because I thought that would be simpler than actually moving to my sewing machine. So I have centered the circle on the plate. And these, of course, are not actual fabrics that I would use, but I wanted you to have good visibility. So that's why I used a really dark circle. So let's watch the little video and I will kind of narrate. Okay, so I have it set so the needle stops down and you would use matching thread or a neutral thread that blends. I'm using a contrasting thread so that you can see it. I have my stitch length set short so that I don't have to stop and pivot. I can just continue to sort of rotate the patchwork underneath the foot. Anytime you have to stop and pivot when you're sewing a circle, you will get a little bobble. So it looks nicer if you just shorten your stitches up enough that you don't. There, I tried to get you in a little bit closer so you could see. So it's near the edge. It's not right on the edge. And yours will look nicer than this because you would have used a darker thread. You would use matching thread. All right, so you applique the circles to the plates in that way. And now we're going to applique the plate onto its background fabric. And so again, I have set it so the needle will only stop down. And I'm sewing right near the edge of the blades, the points. So first of all, I stitch in place a few times, or you could use your stitch securing function if you had it. Now I've lengthened my stitches, but they're still really short. They're 2 millimeters or less. That's so that you can come out as close as possible. If you have really long stitches, you will never get it to come out correctly. So short stitches work the best here. And then I stop when I'm still on the yellow, and I pivot with the needle down, do my stitches up to the point, pivot with the needle down, and so on. So watch here how I stop before one, right? The last stitch in the blue is where I stop and pivot. Sometimes, okay, here I wasn't sure if I could get another stitch, so I went ahead and pivoted. And coming up here, there's one where I cut it pretty close. I think it was the next one. So you can see, just take it a little bit at a time. It's not difficult. Okay, here, I thought, can I get one more stitch? Barely made it. So pivot with the needle down. And I do pin, you can see my pins. I pinned my plate in place so that it didn't move. And here I'm just going to rotate it so that you can kind of see how the stitches look. Now, again, that's darker thread than I would use for this fabric. I would use a much lighter thread so that it blended in a little better. So that's this process of appliquing that down. And then I took a picture, just a still shot so that you could see how it looks. So you can see it's not totally perfect, but you would be using matching thread or blending thread, so it would look nicer than this. And the key is short stitches. And let me show you. So here's one of my actual plates that's on one of the Summer Splash quilts. And you can see I chose red thread, so it blends really well on those darker blades, and it's a little more visible on the pink. But in the big picture of the quilt, that is not going to be a problem at all. So there's the big picture. So you can kind of see if you had a little bobble, it's not going to matter. It's totally fine. And here's the autumn version. So I believe this is the one where there's a stripe for one of the fabrics. I ran my stripes lengthwise on the blades, but you could certainly run your stripes the other direction if you'd like. Okay. So I want to talk to you just for a moment about the math. Let's see, did I say everything I needed to say about the block? In Summer Splash, and anytime you're making a Dresden plate block, I would cut my background block a little bit bigger than I think I'm going to need it. Sometimes when you applique that plate, it can draw up just a little bit. So if it's supposed to be 6.5 and you cut it 6.5 and then it draws up and then it's only 6.25, and so cut it a little bit larger, applique your plate, and then you trim it when you're done. Okay. And then now I want to talk to you just briefly about the math. And it's really, I just want to say this. I'm not going to go into the math a whole bunch, but I just want to say this. Dresden plate is like a pie. That's all it is. If you cut the pie into fewer pieces, each piece is a little bigger. If you cut the pie into a whole bunch of pieces, each piece is a little smaller. And the same, kind of in the same vein, the pie pieces that are bigger have sides that are more angled. The pieces of pie that are smaller, the real skinny pieces, have pieces that are not so angled. They're more straight up and down. And so you can divide a circle lots of different ways. You can divide it into 10 pieces or 100 pieces or 4 pieces. And how many pieces of pie you have, that determines how steep the sides are and how many pieces of pie it takes to make a whole pie or to make a whole circle. So that's really all I'm going to say about the math, because lots of people aren't that interested in the math, but suffice it to say, The math is really not difficult. If you think of it like pi, it's pretty simple. So again, that's the basics of Dresden plate. There are a zillion variations that you can do with Dresden. It's so much fun. It's so addictive, and I hope that you will give it a try. Remember to look in the chat for a link to the handout so that you have some written instructions. I feel like there might be a couple of little tips that I forgot to say. And so as soon as I think of those, I will write a blog post at Stash Bandit, and then we'll link to that in the forums on the quiltshow.com as well, so that you will have all the little tips. And I'm just going to check and see if there are any questions that I should be answering. Okay. I don't see any questions specifically about Dresden plate. If you have a question, you can put it in the forums on thequiltshow.com, or you're welcome to email me. It's Diane, Diane, at stashbandit.net, and I would be happy to answer your questions about Dresden plate. So that wraps up our short lesson on Dresden plate for today. Thank you so much for being here with me. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch and listen, and I hope you found it inspirational. So, next month, there will be lesson number 3 for Summer Splash. If you're interested in looking more closely at the quilt, visit thequiltshow.com and look for Summer Splash. There are still kits available. The kits include the pattern booklet. You can also buy the pattern booklet as a standalone piece. So I speak and teach for quilt guilds and shops and events everywhere. If you have enjoyed today, I would so appreciate it if you would share my name, Diane Harris. My business is called Stash Bandit, and I want to thank the Quilt Show for letting me take their space over for a few minutes today. It's been a delight to work with them, and I thank you all so much for being here. All right, take good care. Bye now.